I've completed all the work I need to do in Illustrator. Now it's time to get these vectors over to Photoshop for some additional work. I'm just going to select all of this and then copy it, Command-C, switch over to Photoshop and paste Command-V. I tell Photoshop I want to paste as paths, which will preserve the vectors in the Paths palette. To avoid confusion later on, I'm renaming this path as Original. I want to separate the outside line, the inside line, the bolts, and the insets into their own paths, and the best way to do that is create 3 duplicates of the original path and then delete the parts of each path I don't want. I rename this one Outside, this one Inside, Bolts, and Insets. For the insets, I only want to keep this and this. Using the white selection tool, I can highlight specific parts of the vector lines and delete them. I'll do the same thing with the bolts, inside, and outside paths. Now I'm going to take each of these paths and convert them into saved selections. In the Options portion of the Paths palette, I choose Make Selection. While it's selected, I go to Select, Save Selection, and I'll call this one Outside SEL. I'll do the same thing with the other 3. Now I'm ready to load a selection, fill it with color, and start applying special effects. Before I do anything else though, I want to create a new layer. Putting individual elements on separate layers gives me the flexibility to make changes easily as I try out different ideas. With layer 1 selected, I load the selection Outside from the Load Selection palette. Now I want to designate a new fill color. I've decided that red 121, green 78, and blue 55 is going to give me a nice brown color. On a Mac, the keyboard shortcut to fill up a selection with the foreground color is Option-Delete. I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see it a little bit better. While the layer is active, I'm going to hit the Special Effects button and then choose Bevel and Emboss. I want to make sure the angle of lighting is consistent, and I can control that from here. I want the style to be Inner Bevel and the technique Chisel Hard. I want the size to be at 10 pixels. I want the highlight opacity to be set at 85%, which will make the highlight a little bit brighter. I want the color of that highlight to be something other than white, so I'm going to click right here and dial in 242, 203, and 21, which gets me a nice warm gold color. Next, I'm going to create the inner letters. I'll create a new layer. Let's call this Inside. Then load the appropriate selection and fill it with a nice brass color. 217, 177, 54 should do it. Click OK, then Option-Delete to fill the selection with the foreground color, and lastly, deselect. Rather than reinventing the wheel, I'm going to take the special effects I already created here and apply them to the inside layer. The way that I do this is to hold down the Option key and drag the Layer 1 effects onto the inside layer. I see the bevel I want, but now I'm going to make some adjustments to the colors. I want to choose this color to be more of an orange, 245 for the red, 136 for the green, and 39 for the blue should suffice. The opacity changes from 85 to 100%, and the blend mode goes from screen to vivid light. You see the result here, a nice bright highlight. I'm also going to change the shadow color from black to a dark purple. 47, 5, and 10. The opacity on this one also goes to 100%, and the blend mode changes from multiply to darker color. The result is some very nice contrast between the purple and the gold. Since these letters have some dimension, it makes sense that there should be a shadow cast on the right side. I go back to Effects and choose Drop Shadow with lots of options for customization. I think I want a little more dramatic look, so I'll make the opacity more to make the shadow darker. Turning the preview on and off allows me to see the before and after to help me decide if I like it. I do like it, so I'll click to accept it. I've achieved an interesting look, but it's a little too clean for steampunk. The next few techniques will add some grime and roughness for the sake of character. Before I do that though, I want to add another layer of bright highlights into these layers here, but I can't get there with the same techniques I've used before. Instead, I'll make a new layer, name it Bright Highlight, then load the inside selection again. I'll turn off these layers so you can better see what I'm doing. The color that I've chosen is a neutral gray. Any RGB combination where the three values are the same will result in a gray of some kind. Option Delete fills the selection with the foreground color, then I deselect the letters. Now I'm going to apply the same effects from the inside layer onto the highlight layer by option dragging the bevel and emboss settings. Double-clicking on the settings allows me to change the parameters. I'm going to change the color to white, then tone down the opacity and click OK. The next step is to hit Command A to select all and save the selection. This will make sense in a minute. Name it Bright Highlight Select. Any saved selection will be stored in the channels. For this process to work, the effect settings need to be made permanent. To accomplish this, I choose Layer, Rasterize, Layer Style. By highlighting the Channels tab, I can isolate this channel by making it active, then turn off the visibility of the other channels. Paste puts the embossed gray letters into the channel. What happens in these selection channels is that anything that is white is selected, anything that is black is not selected. Shades of gray represent varying degrees of opacity. I click the magic wand on the white background, then use Select Similar to get the white inside the letters. I want to fill up the selection with the same gray as the letters. Option Delete does the job. Command L takes me to the Levels palette, where I darken the gray colors until they become black. Further adjustments of the sliders results in a selection of just the brightest parts of the letters. Remember, this is now a saved selection. The bright white areas are fully selected, with the gray fading to black being a fade out from selected to not selected. I turn off the selection channel and turn on the RGB channels before heading back to the Layers palette. I no longer need the Bright Highlights layer, so I'll turn it off. I'll make a new layer and call it Bright Highlight Color. Turn the inside and outside layers back on and zoom in so I can see what's happening. I'll need a nice bright foreground color. 255, 255, and 0 is a very bright yellow. Now I load the Bright Highlight selection and fill it with the yellow foreground color. The result is an extra bit of shine, which helps to sell the idea that the letters are made of metal. Now I'm going to create the bolts and insets. Best practice dictates that I make a new layer. The next step is to load the bolt selection from the saved selections. I've decided that I want to do the bolts and insets as one element, even though they're two separate selections. This is not going to be a problem because I can go back to Save Selections and load the insets, but instead of designating the insets as a new selection, I can choose Add to Selection, which will combine the bolts and the insets into one selection. This new selection should be filled with the same color as the letters, so I can simply sample the color from the letters and Option Delete. If I turn off the other layers and zoom in, you can see the results. I want these elements to have a very similar style as what's going on with the letters, so again, a simple option drag makes the task of transferring the special effects settings a very easy one. I see a problem here because the drop shadow is too wide for these thin elements. So I'm going to double click to get into the effects and isolate just the drop shadow parameter. I'm going to make the size quite a bit less. Now, when I turn on my other layers, I can see that the bolts and insets are working as a believable addition to the letters. The shading and the colors are right where I want them to be, so now I can address texture issues. This is much too clean to be representing the grit and grime of steampunk. I'll begin with a new layer labeled Texture. A quick trip to load selection to activate the outside selection. After making sure my foreground and background colors are set to the default black and white, I'm going to Filter, Render, Clouds. Let's move this layer to the top to get it above the bolts, then change the blend mode of the layer to Multiply, which results in a smoky look. I can change the opacity of the layer to make the look more subtle. I think I can make this even more interesting by adding some texture to the clouds. I navigate to Filter, Texture Gallery, Textures, Texturizer. I have several choices, but I think sandstone is going to work best. I can adjust the texture to make it rougher or smoother, or a greater or lesser height. I can adjust the direction of the light to make it consistent with the bevel on the letters. As I zoom in to look at it, I realize that the texture has toned down the bright highlight too much. Changing the stacking order of the bright highlight layer by dragging it to the top solves this problem. I can experiment further by adding another texture layer that is rougher or smoother than the first one to get a more complex texture. I can play with the colors to see if reds or browns work better than black. After some experimenting, I wind up with a result that looks like this. I think this logo needs a background. I create a new layer called Rock Wall. I'm going to move it below the other layers, then set the foreground, background colors to the default black and white. Command A to select all, then I'm going to do a variation on the technique I used to get the letter texture. I go to Filter, Render, Clouds to once again get a smoky look. Now I'll go back up to Filter and choose Stylize, Emboss, and you can see that this gives me a rocky looking texture. I can adjust the height and the amount to make a finer or denser surface. Notice I have the light source coming from the same direction as my other effects for the sake of consistency. Again, using a variation on a previous technique, I'm going to create a selection that will allow me to add color to the highlights on the rocks. I select all, copy the rocky texture, then save the selection and name it Rock Highlight. I move over to the Channels palette and isolate the Rock Highlight selection. Then paste in the texture. Using the Levels palette, I can darken up the image so that the areas that are left white will become selections I can fill with any color I want to create the highlights on the rocks. Once back in the layers, I can adjust the color of the rocks by going to Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation. Clicking the Colorize button allows me to use the Hue, Saturation, and Lightness sliders to apply any color I want. I think a very deep purple will be a nice contrast with the brass letters, something like this. Now I'll make a new layer called Rock Highlight Color, then load the Rock Highlight selection. Let's try a pretty bright gold orange color. Option Delete to fill up the selection with the foreground color. Because the highlight is on its own layer, I have lots of options for adjustments. I think it's too bright, so I can bring down the opacity. I can also try different blend modes. I think this is the sweet spot I've been looking for, so I'll stop here. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found these techniques helpful. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions.